Okay, let's finish the Rugosa. So, like I was starting to say, this is a survival adaptation, and it is seen to this day in some modern hexacorals. And here they are. Look at that. All right, so let's keep going. Now, one of the other insane things that rugose corals do is they'll make offsets in certain types. Now, offsets are kind of related to rejuvenescence in that, see all these little new corals that are spouting from, this is the rim of a great big old coral about this size. These little guys, these little offsets, don't go through the earliest part of their gestation, so they miss out the entire brephic stage, and they don't go through the later parts. So they may get to just barely the adult stage, but they kind of get stuck in the neanic stage. Yeah, teenage life forever. It's not clear what the purpose of these is, because at least in this case, the main cup itself stops growing when the little cups start to grow. And it is hypothesized that these would be sterile because they don't go through enough of their development to get to the point where they can have babies. That may not be the case. That's just the current conservative thinking on the matter. But in that case, it's unclear exactly what would be going on with these. Here's Calceola sandalina, fantastic little rugose coral, and this one has an operculum. It's not common, it's mostly just this group, but they are rugose corals, and yeah. So the cardinal septum, I believe, is down here. I believe that's the counter that's up there. Or I may have those backwards, I am not sure. But this is a rugose coral cup. Yeah, pretty insane. And it looks like a little elf sandal, Calceola sandalina. And we have those, so you can have a look at those. And they're really fascinating. They don't look like other rugose corals, and yet they are. Yeah. So, one other thing to know about rugose corals is we can talk about their desepiments. So desepiments, so remember the things running across the middle, those are tabuli. And these things coming in from the side, these little sort of half moon shapes, those are desepiments. So they're made of the same skeletal material as everything else, but they are always found packing the side and effectively thickening it, and we think strengthening it. How do we know this? Well, here are two corals that have suffered horrendous injuries. Look at this. It's like nature gave a karate chop through like 10 boards here, only the boards were the tabuli of this poor coral. And remember, the coral animal itself is living on top of this. And so if it's being smacked hard enough that it is breaking, what is that, 10, 15 little layers down here? And then look, it happened over here and it happened over here. Those seem like they shouldn't be survivable. That is, like a head-on crash, bicycle into a truck level of force, I would think, relative to the coral. And yet, this coral came back from that, and it was able to survive. And this coral came back from it, and then suffered another, slightly less horrendous injury, but came back from that. These things are like Evel Knievel. They just keep getting up. They just keep not quite jumping the gorge. But if you notice what happens here, the desepiments around the crush site hold up pretty well. There's maybe a broken one or two on this side. And the desepiments up here and in this crush incident seem to hold up perfectly. So those things are strengthening the cup, and I think they are helping it to survive in environments where there's a lot of energy and there's a greater chance of horrendous extreme damage. I think this gives the coral a chance to recover from that. And corals were tough. If you can come back from that, that's breaking all your bones, because they only have the one floor that they sit on, and that is shattered, absolutely shattered. But yeah, but they made it, so kind of interesting. All right, here's our little coral mascot at the top. It's Recordia yuma is the name of it. So here is a coral exhibiting a little bit of pathology. So this coral, you can see it when it's grown up. It has a problem. It has something that is bored into the cup and is growing there, like embedded itself. It's in bad shape. Now this thing has a pretty clear cardinal septum from early on, and in the earliest parts of its development, the development's not really messed up. It looks pretty normal. But you go a little later and look at this little shrunken septum, and it just never really grows up, Peter Pan style. Here the coral's trying to cover it over. There's like something wrong with this area. And here we've covered it over and built a new septum on top of it, just sort of walling off the problem. Here is the original cardinal septum, and look, this thing has put in a second cardinal septum right next to it. So it's basically doing rejuvenescence. There may have been two little coral animals in the same cup, which would have been absolutely crazy. But it's a thing that happens sometimes. Here's our latest really detailed molecular phylogeny of corals. And yeah, so the question is, where would rugose corals fit in all of this? So we don't know for sure because we don't have any genes, but we can infer a lot of things based on the way these corals develop. And they're not all corals, they're all cnidarians. But let's look at some of these weird groups. So the earliest branching group are these endocnidozoa. These are obligate intracellular parasites. It's a coral that lives inside the cells of a sturgeon fish as part of its life cycle. And the other part, it's like free living on the outside. That's an insane thing, yeah, for me to even say. But those are the most primitive genetically cnidarians that are around. Or they've undergone the most change. It's possible that that part is wrong on this tree, but yeah, it's the best that these authors were able to come up with, and they did a pretty careful job, I would say. Next you've got over here, and these are the things that most people would call, it's a mix of jellyfish and a few things that are kind of like soft corals, but not really. And they're going to include things like a box jellyfish here, and a lot of the jellyfish, the things you would think of as a jellyfish, are going to be in either the Scyphozoa or the Hydrozoa. Over here you've got the Anthozoa. These are the hard shelled corals. If you can think of them just as an ordinary reef shell with an unusual tentacled hunting apparatus. Which is kind of like everything else we've talked about, isn't it? Yeah. That could have just described brachiopods, couldn't it? Yeah. And so in this one, you've got your early branch, which are your octocorals that have eightfold symmetry. Then you've got your hexacorals that are here, and the first branch off of those is the zoantharia. And Ceriantharia are the next branch over. So those are an earlier branch before hexacorals. And so, and then down here you get the scleractinians and you get corallomorphs. Now, corallomorphs, if you know your cnidarians, look really weird. These don't even really look like other corals, and yet developmentally and genetically, they're pretty similar. So, yeah, get over that. All right, so here's the parasitic one, endocnidozoa. These are the ones when they're living kind of free on their own, but very strange looking. Look at that, yeah. And yeah, inside of a fish, yeah. Here are Ceriantharians, so this is the branch before, and these include tube anemones. So here's one down here in panel C. And Staurozoa are the ones that look most like corals but are down on the jellyfish side of the family. I say that word with inner cringing because it doesn't really mean anything biologically. Okay, octocorals. So now we're getting closer to hexactinellids. They're octocorals, but octocorals have a really weird skeleton. The skeleton is made up of, they're effectively spicules, but unlike sponge spicules, they have a little bit of a different shape. So these are, they're called sclerites, and these make up the hard parts of corals like gorgonians and sea fans. You can spot these things. They're some of these are pretty common in aquariums. Just count them. If they have 8 little tentacles coming off every single one, very accurately counting to 8, you're talking about an octocoral. And sometimes they'll have feathery little mini tentacles coming off the main one. So how do these octocorals make their skeleton? Inside of cells. And the early stages, or one way to do it is to make it inside of one cell, but also you can have, for some of the larger, more elaborate ones, you can have a couple of different cells. These are going to be formed in the middle layer of the coral, yeah, so they're going to give strength to the coral. So that's an unusual way to do it because it's not like the corals that we know, but octocorals are pretty old, and we don't have a great fossil record for them. They probably go back much farther than we think they go back, at least in terms of what the genetics look like. So did the rugose corals die out properly at the end of the Paleozoic? That's what your textbook would say if we had a textbook. And that's what a lot of people would say. But if you look at the last corals in the Paleozoic, and you look at the earliest corals in the Mesozoic, there is a patch of several million years where there are no coral fossils that are known. So if these things existed, they did not leave fossils, or we have not yet found the fossils that they left. So yeah, it was a rough time. There's also a hypothesis that all the mineralizing corals with like skeletons died out, and a branch that had not mineralized managed to survive, which is why we don't have great fossils of it, or any fossils of it yet. And then on the other side, it was able to switch back on its mineralizing genes. However that worked, some combination of mutations or promoter recombination, something like that. No way to say at this point, but people are looking for this. But yeah, there's a lot of similarities between those corals. They're not identical, but similar. So what's similar about these things? Well, if you look at modern corals, scleractinians, they'll put in a big septum, and then they'll have 6 of those, and halfway between those they'll put in a medium-sized septum, and halfway between those they'll put in little septa. And it's not that they're big, medium, and little, it's just that they're first, second, and third, and the older a septum is, the bigger a septum is, because that's how biology works. Yeah, older is bigger up to a point. So corals like this, if you see them without the animal on top, just look at the skeleton, they look exactly like that. And if you compare the mesenteries, so these are like the flesh parts that are going around the skeleton and are dividing the animal up into chambers that are for replication or chambers that are for eating, stuff like that. You'll see it's got 6 nicely divided chambers, and it does different things in different ones, so looking great. Corallimorphs are not mineralized, but if you slice them open, which is a mean thing to do to them, but if you were to do that, what you would find inside is there would be essentially the same pattern of mesenteries that you find in a normal scleractinian coral. And so the development of corallimorphs and scleractinians appears to be pretty closely linked, except that one doesn't make a skeleton, the other group does. And genetically they're different enough that they get their own names as groups. Here's your rugose corals, so with your addition north of the alars and either side of the cardinal. And there are corals out there, which is the zoantharia. These are the ones that were the earliest branch of the hexacorals, and their development is actually very similar to that of rugose corals, some of the late rugose corals. Because some of the late rugose corals develop, in addition to those 4 protosepta, they pick up 2 more, which are called the contralaterals, which are over here next to the counter. KL, again, makes more sense in German, I think. So that gives you your 6 septa, but clearly this is bilateral symmetry. This is nothing like, it's not even good pseudo 6-fold symmetry. You want to meet these guys? Here are some zoantharians. Look at that. There are quite a few of these around. They're still doing okay. And it may well be, at least in terms of development, they are showing a similar development pattern, except that they have no skeleton. So they're kind of like an unmineralized version of a rugose coral. Now, whether they are genetically the same or whether this is what they would call an atavistic trait, like it's like a throwback trait to something in their shared ancestry, and the rugose coral lineage is, dead as a doornail, that we don't know. But yeah, potentially these are living rugose corals walking around among us, not walking at all, just waving around among us, waving their tentacles. So there you go. There are some reading questions. We'll cover some of these in the lecture. And thanks very much. I hope you liked rugose corals, because they're great.